Buonasera a tutti, buonasera.
Good evening to you all.
Ringraziamo i nostri ospiti, Marco
We'd
Galloni,
like to thank our guest, Marco Galloni,
la storia della scienza e della medicina.
history of science and medicine, and in fact with him we will have a historical overview of medicine and veterinary science in Turin. Bergero sitting next to him,
Veterinario, medico veterinario,
who's a veterinary, and in particular he is involved and interested in horses, and he will be telling us a lot about that. And lastly, Professor Paola Sacchi. She too is a veterinary doctor, and she will focus more on the future. She's more focused on genetics and improvement of breeds, and we will see what we will be expecting in the years to come. No more time because we have three speakers, and we ask them to please to leave enough time for questions and stick to the time they've been given. 20 minutes, please. So at the end, we will have time for your questions. I introduced them, and also because I've introduced them in this order because this is the order in which they're going to speak. So Marco Galloni, the floor to you. Good evening to you all. And in fact, I am merely going to say that the clip can start. Let us enjoy this documentary, and then we can comment it.
La nostra storia comincia molto tempo fa.
Our story starts a long, long time ago when humans and animals met for the first time.
Prima la caccia, poi l'addomesticamento.
First there was hunting and then domestication, and the history of humans is closely intertwined with that of animals because our well-being also depends on theirs.
Per l'uomo, animale vuol
For
dire movimento,
humans, animal means food, movement, raw materials, friendship, and sharing.
la pace.
We use them both in peace and war.
Nel Medioevo il maniscalco, oltre a
In the Middle Ages, the blacksmith, as well as shodding horses and cattle, was also involved in dealing with their health. In fact, epidemics amongst horses and cattle show that the practical experience that blacksmiths had accrued was not enough.
Nel Cinquecento,
In the 1500s, with Andrea Desaglio and Carlo Ruilli, the knowledge of anatomy, both human anatomy and animals, improves. And there is a new method that develops, a more scientific one. And with the 1600s and Galileo Galilei, science moves into its more modern approach, and medicine too defines physiology on a scientific basis. And the war needed new skills to have horses for the cavalries. Lots of animals are required. Just one regiment at the time used 700 horses, and you need 30 pairs of horses to position cannons. The Enlightenment plays a key role in this, changing the way in which humans and nature, and Giovanni Battista Morgagni, at the time of these major changes, rethinks pathological anatomy on a more systematic basis.
È il tempo dell'enciclopedia e anche la cura della
This is the time in which the encyclopédie, Diderot's encyclopedia, was drafted. And animals too have become the object of scientific research. And Louis XV asked de Bourgelat to establish the first veterinary school in Europe.
69. Il re di Sardegna Carlo Emanuele III
In 1769, the King of Sardinia, Charles Emanuel III, established the Turin Veterinary School, very few years after the Lyon one, 1769. And that is the date which leads us to our anniversary, the 250th anniversary, and the fourth school in Europe. Giovanni Carlo Brugnone, who studied in Lyon, was the first director of the veterinary school and in charge of training the military blacksmiths. A person who's rather authoritarian, complex person. For 24 years, he ruled the school, in fact, was the only lecturer of the school that was established at the Valentino
rimane anche una
Castle.
caricatura disegnata da un suo studente.
We also have a caricature of his that a student drew.
Nel 1793 la
In
scuola
1793, the school was moved, the first from the Venaria to the Mandria in Chivasso, which was a big estate where horses were bred for the army.
Vittorio Amedeo III nel 1785
Victor Amadeus III in
fonda
1785
Trino Vercellese
established in Trino Vercellese a hospital managed by Francesco Toggia alongside the school. And for example, here you can see his treatise on the horses' external diseases. With Napoleon's conquest of Piedmont in the 1800s, Chivasso was transferred to the Valentino Castle in Turin.
Direttore è Michele Buniva,
At the
docente
time, Michele Buniva, who was a progressive university lecturer who had already worked for Brugnone for comparative studies on animal and human diseases. He wrote a few texts for the new school, suggesting also prophylaxis, which is still implemented to date.
infatti in prima fila nell'introduzione.
He was in the forefront of, for example, the introduction of smallpox vaccination in Piedmont.
Ormai la strada era segnata.
At this point, the road was ready, and the breeders needed specialized professionals, and not just of healers, illiterate healers, or military blacksmiths. And here we have Carlo Lessona, who is one of the most important. Victor Emmanuel I, who was reinstated, appointed him as director of the school in 1837. He established the Annals of Veterinary Studies, the first such in
Per la
Italy.
diffusione di una grave epizoosia nel 1800
Because of a major diseases in 1834, the veterinary school was transferred to the castle of Fossano, and at that time Carlo Giorgio Mangosio was the director and one of the first legal medical experts who wrote a key text. To that date, the school had in fact been mainly a military approach, and the colonel always chaired the school. But in Fossano, the style of the school became less military.
Nel 1841 la
In 1841, the school went back to Venaria, and under the new director, Francesco
scuola per
Papa.
motivi politici
For political reasons, he was then moved, but he continued to fight the empirical approach in the countryside and became the secretary of the Italian Royal Veterinary Academy. He also focused on teaching a lot, as his herbarium, that is to say, the plants needed for veterinary science, shows. In 1859, the school moved to Viennizza in Turin, and thanks to Giovanni Battista Ercolano, who was then the director.
Docente di anatomia è una figura tanto
He
emblematica.
was an anatomy lecturer, and he was so important that so much so that a newspaper was named after him, being called the New Ercolani. Soon after, in 1860, the Ministry of Education listed the school as one of the university faculties, which was very important to lead to the recognition of veterinary surgeons. 1867, Felice Perosino was head of the Veterinary Service of United Italy, continuing the tradition where there had been military personnel attached to the school. To celebrate the first 100 years of the school in 1869, we have the first national veterinary conference. The school is then directed by Domenico Vallada, who introduced a more scientific approach to animals used for human consumption. In 1870, Edoardo Perroncito's career started. He was an anatomopathologist who focused on parasites and diseases. His study led to the first chair of parasitology established ever in the world. He was a friend of Pasteur's, and he also introduced the idea of vaccination against carbunculum, and also the importance of mineral water. In 1888, the Crispi-Baiani law established the existence of country veterinary surgeons. At the time, Roberto Bassi was directing the school, and here you can see him in a picture by Morgari while he is holding a lesson in the courtyard of the school. The museum also has a number of surgical implements. For example, this is to remove decayed teeth from horse mouths. Vaccinations changed the world of breeding, which is why the expert needed to know how to communicate both with politicians and with farmers. Giovanni Mazzini played that role very effectively.
L'acquisizione delle colonie africane
The African colonies in 1882 for veterinary surgeons meant coming in contact with new species and developing a knowledge in tropical animals, while in Italy, selection of breeds developed using also artificial insemination. Ferruccio Faelli wrote a number of books on this that were illustrated by very good photos.
Con la fine dell'Ottocento e l'inizio
The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, animals started to lose importance in terms of transport and replaced by engines. And the role of many blacksmiths decreased, while the veterinary surgeon became more and more important. World War I, that is known in Italy as the Big War, and the veterinary surgeons in the army looked after the animals, mules, dogs, pigeons, horses. Students were also sent to the front. and they produced a number of sera which is the Batranchi Finzi one, to fight the infection of wounds. The school became a faculty, the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, in 1934.
La dignità di dottore in medicina veterinaria valorizza il ruolo.
Veterinary surgeons were therefore called doctors, and they played a role as health officials, and they learned how to drive their red cars, which were distinctive of their profession. In the meantime, with the shrinking importance of the horse, veterinary surgeons took more interest in domestic animals.
La Seconda Guerra Mondiale
World War II was a moment where many veterinary surgeons were called up because the school was bombed, and also in 1944, Professor Paolo Braccini, who was a lecturer and partisan, was also shot dead.
Il dopoguerra è segnato dalle
The
ristrettezze.
post-war period didn't see that many people being wealthy, but in the 50s the economic boom started, and veterinary surgeons played a very important role in modernizing animal husbandry and food. Here you can see meat, Simmental meat. The people who eat more meat are better off. Butter is good.
La scuola si adegua
The school adapted, updating teaching, and also introducing new subject. Giovanni Godina was a pioneer in this process of modernization, studying in vitro cells using film.
Nel 1969 la scuola
In
celebra
1969, the school was 200 years old, more and more students, and in Grugliasco we have more and more buildings in Grugliasco where the new faculty was established close to the agrarian studies. Currently, there's animal husbandry as well as surgery, technological and scientific monitoring of animals, and a focus on animal diseases that are transmissible to humans. It is constant research to defend both animal and human welfare. In the department laboratories, we have advanced technology using very complex instruments. Doctors and surgeons carry out surgery linked to teaching.
Il campus ospita
The campus has also examples of breeding where the students can learn and can also see which are the best solutions to breed healthy animals.
Il museo dove abbiamo fatto il
The
viaggio
museum,
nella nostra storia
which we use for this journey, has the memory of our school and transfers the ancient tradition, passes it down to remind us that our future has an ancient heart.
Bene, abbiamo visto questo racconto.
Well, you've seen this movie and the story, and I would like to complete it with the time I have, focusing on 2 or 3 points which I think are interesting.
Intanto, appunto, adesso
First of all, when you see the images, here they are, you will observe how we have a centaur that appears in several of these logos, the department, the one for the 250th anniversary, and it's a symbol of veterinary science, half man, half animal, and tradition tells us that the centaur was also a medical skill, and this was a symbol established at the end of World War I. Here you see its chyron, when we had a memorial for our students who died in World War I, and here you see the logo for this year, 250th anniversary. Can you see the object, which is halfway through the logo, is not just a decoration, but it is a veterinary instrument and chosen because of its shape. It is known in Italian as the cacciaboli, and it is to throw or insert the bolus in the horse's mouth. Here you can see it's a bit like a bicycle pump, and here you can see a bolus on the right. It's a drug. You push this instrument down the horse's mouth and push it down the horse's throat. This is yet another object. Here we will have see various jackknives. This has been transformed into an instrument with three different uses, in particular for bloodletting, because they thought that both for animals and humans, if you let the blood out, you thought that all the negative flows were let go, and therefore the disease cues. Here, this is another object that is that you can see in our museum. It's called an automat. It's an electronic, or electric at least, instrument. End of the 1950s. Atomat, it's called. It reminds us of atoms. This was the advertising. Here you can see the atomat. You will observe that there is a disquieting mushroom which reminds us of the atomic bomb, and this was a Geiger counter, which tells us about the fear in the Cold War period, when people were really worried, and it was manufactured in Germany but also sold in Italy. It was the time when the gamma rays and radiations were something that we were thinking of using them in a more positive way, for example, for sterilization of food to eliminate bacteria. But then there is yet another interesting one, and to do this I'm going to take you to a rather unusual place. These are the Caudano caves, very beautiful. You can visit them. Why did I bring you here, and why is it in what way is it linked to the atom? Because at the time, in 1961, there was an expedition underground which was called 700 Hours Underground. Why, and why were the veterinary surgeons involved? 700 hours were considered the necessary time because in the case of the explosion of an atomic bomb, people who managed to be in the cave underground, and after 700 hours they could come out relatively sure that the atomic fallout had blown away. And to do this, and to see whether there was a real possibility, some experts, veterinary surgeons, and people from our faculty at the time, went underground with animals and lived there for 700 hours, proving that it would be possible to seek refuge with animals who would have given food and survive very well. And this was an experimental demonstration. Here you see the people who spent 700 hours underground to say how many things can be discussed when referring to veterinary science, because it is a very complex story, as has been mentioned in the movie, and sometimes there are unexpected outcomes.
Bene. Grazie a Marco Galloni.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco Galloni. And now the flow to Domenico Bergero, who is the director of the Department of Veterinary Science of the University of Turin, and he in particular is an expert in horses and equine studies.
Buonasera a tutti, cercherò di...
Good evening to you all. I hope I won't bore you. I'll be talking about equestrian studies because that was the first of the
Perché I cavalli
animals studied here. Why? Well, because the domestication of horses is very ancient, several thousand years, but the moment in which people realized that horses could also be used in war, that then became the main focus for them in all the civilized countries. Many wars were carried out also to obtain horses. Here you have Alexander the Great in the Battle of Issus. But think also of the Terracotta Army. And in all times, horses, throughout time, horses became a weapon for war, which meant that they were also a status symbol. They were not just useful in wars, but also in many other activities. If we think of the horses in the Middle Ages, of course we will think about heavy or stock cavalry, or Braveheart, but you'll also think of duels. So from this point of view, throughout time, and this hasn't yet finished, horses have been used not just as a weapon, but also as an amusement, as a means to interact with nature, with, of course, the tools of each period, of each age. In the 16th century, during the Neapolitan Equestrian Academy, Federico Grisone, who is quite famous because in the meantime we have had the printing press and he'd written a book, he said that the horse is a raw diamond and that human beings must refine it. This was the way in which people thought of horses, while one should ask ourselves when the Turin school started. Here you can see that Diderot and d'Alembert said that all our knowledge could be put in writing, and at that time, in 1769, which is when the school was first established, the pages of the Encyclopédie on equestrian studies and horse riding, they published areas. These are still the horses of the 16th century. They're horses that are not real horses. They're the image of the horse, and the image of the horse is not the horse at war, but for the science of the aristocracy. This is the school, the one which we have Jerez de la Frontera, or the Spanish school in Vienna, or in others too. There are no more equestrian schools because the fashion has gone by, but all the exercises of the high school, equestrian school, have a French definition, la courbade, la courvette. These were in origin Neapolitan words, which then were taken in by the French. This is the century of enlightenment, when there are 21 veterinary schools. Diderot and d'Alembert still convey the image of a 16th century school. The transition was not complete. We still haven't really established the new definition of a horse. So what you see on the left is a page of the Encyclopedia, 1753, one of the very first, which refers to the side pulls that have to be put on a horse, and they're rather cruel. You can't see it, but they also had spikes. The one on the right is a mouthpiece, which is the one which Grisone described. He used extremely fierce ones. Their horses were very different from ours, but that notwithstanding, if you look at the two images, the transition was not easy or complete. At the same time, we also have the initial studies of the anatomy of horses. I would like to mention George Stubbs, the one who also painted Whistlejacket, that became an example in the National Gallery. In 1766, he drew a book of anatomy of the horse, and he hung horses, drew them, and then started taking away their skin or skinning them and then taking the muscles off. And it's very difficult to exceed it in terms of macroscopic anatomy. At the same time, or even before that, in 1601, Caravaggio, who painted things as they were, the dirty feet of the farmers who adored the Virgin. Here you see the conversion of St. Paul, and it is a country horse there. In fact, the horse has nothing celestial like it. In fact, people didn't like this painting. He had to repaint it. And this is one of the horses that he actually saw. This type of drive continued in spite of the fact that in the same years there was still an image of the horse which was the ideal horse. Look at Louisa Ludovica Christine of Savoy. She is sitting on a side saddle with high heels, with one hand on her bridle and the other one she is waving. The head and neck could be part of a circle, small ears, and here you can see her little footman. You can't really see it, there's too much light, but there are two dogs, and he is probably going to a hunt. This tells us that there were different types of horses. Giovanni Brugnone, in a book of his, he describes thousands of different types of horses, starting with the military one, then one for the officers, and then the carriage one, then the plow horse, and then the draft horse, and so on. So clearly there are different ways of seeing the horse, and although it is scientific, it still suffers from many different tools necessary to interpret the horse. In fact, no one knows how horses move. George Stubbs, who draws a dead horse so perfectly, while the horse is galloping.
Teodoro Géricault nel 1821 li dipinge ancora allo stesso modo.
Draws them as if the front feet were moving forward and the back ones backward. When is it that we are able to identify the different approach? With photographs. And here you see it 1878. Before that, we were unable to see it.
Ecco, i Savoia, nel
This
momento in cui
is Charles Albert.
hanno bisogno di una
These Savoie,
veterinaria, lo fanno per i
or
cavalli
Savoy,
delle truppe, perché hanno
when they
capito che
decide that they need a veterinary school, they do it for the army horses, because they understand that it is not enough to control the valleys. You need a strong army, you need a credible army,
il cavallo che Carlo Alberto immagina
and
per i
also
suoi
to
eserciti
manage their alliances. The horse that Charles Albert sees for his army is a
atletico da
horse
un
like
lato, ma che è
this.
molto agli ordini dall'altro. Ed è un
Very
po'
frisky, athletic, but also obeys. And it is a bit the idea that everyone has. What's the point of going to, what you need to go to war? You need a horse that will obey you. Xenophon used to say that in the ancient Greek period. So there's not much new in the idea they have in creating a new breed, so much so that the School of Veterinary Science is what they used just before Napoleon comes to Italy. This is 1797, the Battle of Rivoli, and not even Napoleon closes this adventure. In fact, with the restoration after Napoleon, there was a great development. Here, I don't know if you can see this slide, but where there are the little stars is where they had the royal breeding for horses. There are many of these around Turin, Mandria and Chivasso, where there was the Veterinary School, the one also in Venaria Reale, but there's one in Sardinia too. The idea of the Savoy was to have a very important breeding of horses. In fact, look here I have put a photo, the drawing, which you probably all know, in Piazza Solferino in Turin. You can see Ferdinand of Savoy,
diciamo immortalato nel momento in cui scende da cavallo,
is shown as he's getting off the horse because his right foot is no longer in the stirrup. His horse is dying because he has been pierced by a weapon, and he's still doing what the rider asks them. This is a horse who, even in a battle, even as it is dying, it is still trying to do what its horseman wants. And this is what any equestrian school would want, a horse that under any circumstance is able to listen to its horseman, because this is a condition for the horseman to survive. Here you can see the 1500 type of approach that they had in Naples didn't work. So in spite of the fact that riding was very coercive until the beginning of the 20th century, this is Tancredi di Savoie in Pinerolo, and we're very proud that we have Pinerolo in our region too. At a certain point, a captain of the cavalry decided that you must work with the horse. Capriglio, his name. Capriglio is a glory of world horse riding, very often forgotten even in Pinerolo itself. But can you see what he does? He said that if he wants to get home alive, I must let the horse gallop as it best wishes. We have an idea that Caprilli was the one who invented horse jumping. But this is a byproduct. What he did was that he said that if one wants a horse to put its foot where it's best place, you must let the horse do it itself. So he invented this new method. It was the beginning of the 20th century, and luckily there was a general who was in charge of horses, and he's General Berta, and he said, in spite of the fact that this man is just a captain, we'll have to do what he says. And Caprilli and Berta were the two geniuses of horse riding. How did this go on? Up to World War II. In fact, I'm just going to give you two figures. I'll finish in 5 minutes. So two very important figures. In World War I, 11 million horses died. In World War II, we used 20 million horses. We don't know how many died. 70% of transport in World War II was horse-drawn. Then, of course, in movies, you see tanks, but behind the tanks, we had horses. In fact, they were our horses, too. Here you can see in Izbuchenski on August the 24th, 1942, the last of the Savoy cavalry. This is where military equestrians found the end of the story with why. In 1902, we have transformed the military horse in something which is an object of leisure. We have an international horse riding. We have the first international one in the world in Turin in 1902. On that occasion, Caprilli jumped 2.8 meters.
A questo salto.
And we get to this jump, 2.47, which is still the world record. It's unbroken. You see, this is another army man. The first and early horse riding championships saw only military men, very few civilians. Then things have changed, and nowadays we have horse jumping where there are very few army people. Why? Because horses have become part of a sport rather than have anything to do with the army. But the image of a horse as a status symbol has remained, because in fact we have horses as testimonials in a number of advertising campaigns. And I think that this is something that we have within ourselves. I can't mention how many of our words and expressions and idioms are derived from the fact that there were a lot of horses. Maybe we'll have time another time, but I just want to leave it at that for this evening. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Domenico Bergero. We've learned also that the Caprilli jump is thanks to the horse, not to the rider. Now we have Paola Sacchi, who's a veterinary surgeon who specializes in animal welfare and genetic improvement.
Questa sera è stato
This evening,
ripetutamente sottolineato.
We have repeatedly stressed the fact how throughout time human beings and animals have been fellow travelers. This very close relationship linking the human species to domestic animals has also had biological implications. The transformation that the genetic human features and animal ones have sometimes accompanied or even have determined the changes in the animal species. Here you can see a urus. The urus is the forefather of all domestic cattle and is certainly the largest and the biggest and most fearful animal that humans have domesticated. Here you can see on the caves of our forefathers the urus has a more religious than artistic role, bearing witness of the reverential fear that early humans had. This cannot be shared if you look at a cow now, which is grazing quite calmly in a field. Now, these changes, that is to say, the shift from the Urus to the present-day cattle, are the result of the natural evolution, but also of a genetic improvement.
La relazione tra
the relationship between human evolution and genetic evolution goes back a long time.
Un progetto di ricerca abbastanza recente.
A research project recently highlighted some of these relations. Here you can see the project has witnessed the participation of 11 research teams that went from paleoarchaeology, paleogenetics to genetics to biochemistry. Results have been published in the most important journals and are available on our website. They tell the story of what we call a milk revolution.
Della popolazione umana, solo il 35% conserva la
Of the
capacità
entire human population, only 35% still maintains the possibility of digesting milk as adults. I think that this is something that many of us know.
anni d'età, questa capacità da molti adulti è
Above 7 or 8, most children lose this, and the biochemical process is very simple. Children,
producono un
many
enzima,
children, well, all children, produce an enzyme called lactase, which is present in their mother's milk and which makes it possible to digest lactose, which is the sugar contained in milk, which is very important for children's guts. And many adults lose this, and the precious enzyme is no longer produced. In the Neolithic period, this was shared by all our forefathers,
500 anni fa,
but
nel cuore dell'Europa e per la precisione
roughly 7,500 years ago, in the heart of Europe, in the Hungarian area, a random event took place, a genetic mutation, which took place, and this changed our relationship. In fact, there was a mutation, a new allele, which is the one for lactase persistence, which makes it possible to digest lactose as adults in adulthood, because it maintains the use of or the function throughout one's life. This mutation is an enormous advantage for our forefathers, because it made, for those of you who had a mutation, it made a new source available, which was available regardless of weather condition, and could also guarantee the survival of the community even when there was a lack of food, or there was hunger because of lack of other sources of food. What has happened is the replacement of a base in the DNA chain. The alphabet of the genetic code is formed by only 4 letters that in different combinations give rise to the entire vocabulary, so to speak, of genes.
di una lettera con un'altra è in grado di cambiare completamente il significato
In the
della
case of words, the replacement of one letter with another may change the meaning of the word. Likewise, for a genetic code, the replacement of a nitrogen base with another means that the meaning of the gene which has been mutated the meaning changes completely. In this case, the replacement of a cytosine with a thymine in an area which is not far from the lactase gene determines the onset of lactase production throughout one's life. The people who had this mutation had a selective advantage which was so big that their offspring had an increase of fertility of 19%. As a result, the new gene spread throughout Europe with a trend that went from south to north following human migrations. And it ended up in the UK and Scandinavia, where 90% of the population tolerates lactose throughout their lives. In Northern Europe, the frequency of tolerance to lactose is very, very high. There are other pockets of tolerance to lactose, in particular to Western Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Africa. This is due to a mutation which is completely different, and they are a very good example of adaptive convergence. But those who are more interested in animal husbandry will observe another effect which is even more interesting. That is to say, a co-evolution, genetic and cultural co-evolution, that sees the matching between cattle herding and lactase tolerance. As you can see in the map on the right, the dashed line indicates the area of Europe where, on the basis of fossils, we have found the early traces of dairy cows, while the area in red represents the area where the tolerance for lactase is more widespread. An odd coincidence. While on the left you can see the results of a research on the genetics of Central European cattle. 72 different breeds were analyzed. You will see that the genetic wave is quite clear, and it's nearly matching to the one on the right. What does this mean? This means that the early attempts to select dairy cows left traces that can be seen in the genome of current breeds. Human beings, as I said, initially saw the random changes which has given rise to us and animals, but soon humans learned the lesson. And in seconds, that is to say in 10,000 years, from the wild urus or urus, they developed 700 breeds of cattle. That is what we have nowadays. An example, which we're very close here, you can see here. Here we have two specimens that belong to the Piedmontese breed and that are about 100 years apart. Differences and are very clear. In the more recent specimen, a bull, there is a development of the muscles that is much more marked, and as you will observe, the profile of the hind leg that highlights it. This feature is the hallmark of the Piedmontese breed, which is hypertrophic development. For the first time, this feature was observed in Guarene d'Alba at the end of the 19th century, and initially it was interpreted as something rather odd, but soon animal breeders realized what the enormous advantage of this sort of animal had, given the more flesh that they had, or more meat that they had, as compared to the normal one. And so very soon this spread. In the 50s, 70% of all the cattle used in the area had this feature, and nowadays virtually all the Piedmontese breed have this feature. In this case, too, this has started with a mutation. The mutation, as the one that we saw for lactase, is the replacement of it's a very small mutation. There is a guanine that replaces an adenine in the gene for the myostatin, which is the gene that codes the protein that regulates muscle mass growth and the relationship between the muscle mass and the development of one's skeleton. If you compare the hypertrophic and normal cattle, was quite easily understood, so that they could select the animals well before they were acquainted with the molecular mechanisms. The studies, and in particular genetics, have made it possible for those who are involved in genetic improvement a series of formation that have been used to address the needs of the market. One example is the one you can see here in the slide, and which recently you will have seen on the posters in our city. It's A2 milk. What is A2 milk? It is the one that contains a type of protein of casein in particular. There are 3 different types, alpha S1, alpha S2, and beta casein. As far as beta caseins are concerned, they have 2 different variants, type A1 or type A2. The difference between the two is in the replacement in an aminoacidic position, 67, in the amino acid chain that is a part of the protein. In the A2 variation, there is a prolin, while in the A1 we have a histidine. This too is the result of a mutation like the others we've seen. However, in the course of digestion, the A2 variant is digested differently. Sorry, the A1 is digested differently, and it gives rise to BCM7 or caseomorphin 7. Scientific literature in the early 90s correlated this peptide with a number of diseases which go from digestion to severe pathologies of the cognitive sphere or even of metabolism. For example, diabetes mellitus that was related to this peptide. In fact, scientific results were very controversial, to the point that the European Authority for Health and Food to issue an opinion, and in 2002 they issued an opinion that confirms the effect of this peptide on intestinal or gut mobility, but scientific evidence was not enough to establish a cause-effect relationship between peptides and the more severe diseases that had been referred to. However, genetic improvement reacted to the market needs, and it was enough to develop a test to recognize the animals who had the A2A2 beta-casein gene that could be identified, and to use them for reproduction, increase the frequency of the gene in the population, and therefore produce milk that exclusively had the type of casein that we wanted. In the examples that I've given so far, one of the desirable features is linked to one gene, and the variation or the variant of the gene is more interesting. But in biological system, there is a higher degree of complexity, and the interesting features of animals are often the outcome of the interaction amongst more genes. The slide, which is a little bit difficult to understand, but represents the 29 chromosomes of the bovine chromosome. The ones which are in color represent genes or genic regions that are involved in the milk production. They're present on all chromosomes, and there are about 6,500 genes. 1/4 of the entire cattle genes are involved, and we're not, in fact, to be surprised, because the survival of a mammal is guaranteed by the mammary gland. However, it also represents existing complexity. The study of each gene has made it possible for researchers to have very important information that also made it possible for us to improve animal production. However, the era of genetics has now been surpassed by genomics, and in particular the genomics of cattle. This means that researchers have been able to read the DNA sequence, seeking for the points of mutation which were somewhat connected with important functions. Therefore, to see which parts could be used to improve the surprising feature is that the mutations which we mentioned, that is to say point mutations, are very, very frequent. In cattle, every 1,000 bases, there is one mutation point. This means that the genome of animals is littered with a series of these mutations. Now, clearly, genetic improvement based on the selection of the individuals that reproduced aimed to a particular gene becomes meaningless, while it is necessary to have a more general view on it. The technique which has made it possible for us to have new tools. So here you can see down below there's a high-density chip, which is a system that makes it possible for us to analyze between 50 to 700,000 mutation points. This means that with one test, we are able to have very precise details of the genome of the animal, the genome, and the choice at this point is a genetic choice.
Con un'analisi molto semplice, a partire da
using a drop of blood or some hairs or a feather, we are able to extract the DNA and to read within the genetic code the ability of each subject as far as production, reproduction, the presence, for example, of undesirable genes because they're linked to diseases, or the presence of genes that we consider an advantage, as is the case of casein 2. Clearly, all this has made the system to improve genetically much more efficient. But above all, it has meant that we have new opportunities to choose objectives that make the genetic improvement closer to our increased awareness to animals. So in the future, we will no longer select only animals that produce more or that have a higher fertility rate or that satisfy us because they give us better milk, but they will also introduce welfare, the ability to adapt to climate change, and coping with stress, for example, heat stress, and the ability to have a production with a reduced environmental impact. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paola Sacchi. Everybody was stuck to their 20 minutes, which means that we have a few minutes for your questions. There is a roaming mic. If there's anyone who would like to ask a question, please. There's a question.
Una domanda giovane.
Young person. Good
Buongiorno.
morning, good afternoon, and my
La mia
question
domanda è,
is
su questa
on this thing of cattle. Well, at school, we spoke about
del fenomeno della
mad cow disease.
ma com'è che cioè perché si doveva
Why did you have to throw the innards away,
come mai
and
si è deciso di smettere di usare
why have people decided to stop using them? Paola Sacchi, I think it's your answer.
Dunque, il fenomeno che
Well,
tutti conosciamo come la
the
mucca
disease that we all know
pazza
as mad cow disease is the result of a disease that affects cattle called spongiform encephalopathy. That is to say, a disease that has the result of an infectious disease that is neither a virus nor a bacterium, but it is a protein, which we call prion because it is very similar to a protein, but it accumulates in the central nervous system and produces a vacuolization, which is why the nervous system becomes sponge-like, which is why it is called spongiform. The pathology or disease raised a big concern. In fact, we were quite lucky in Italy, and we were not really affected by it. The parts that were more at risk, as far as human consumption were concerned, were the parts that contained a part of the nervous system. For example, the brain that as children we used to eat certainly was a risk. The interesting thing of this aspect is that, which will at least interest someone like me, a genetic expert, is that in very similar species, for example, sheep, we discovered that there were genes that gave a virtual resistance to the disease. They were animals that had certain genetic certain genes didn't have it, so it was possible to select within the flocks only and within the herds only the ones that had the resistant forms. So there was a prophylaxis, which was genetic prophylaxis. This was possible both in sheep and in goats, not in cattle. But the veterinary services had developed a monitoring system, a monitoring with very specialized tests that were also carried out here in Turin, and which guaranteed the health of the animals that were going for human consumption. And in that case, we can eat the meat close to the bone. Yes. Any other questions?
Guardo intorno, ma non vedo mani alzate.
I don't see any questions,
di Marco Galloni.
but
Dico una cosa
Marco
solo perché mi
Galloni would
rendo
like to
conto
say
che
something.
nel
I'd like to
titolo
say something because I realize that in the title it's called 250 Years of Veterinary Science, but there's also talk about mine parasites, and I'm mentioning them because it was, in fact, in the title. In fact, that Professor Perroncito that you saw in the movie, and who, rather curiously, his name was also on a mineral water. So famous was he, and he became what we nowadays call a testimonial for a product. His fame came from the fact that as a veterinary parasite expert, he was called at the end of 1870s because they were digging at that time the St. Gothard tunnel between Italy and Switzerland, and after the beginning of the work there, they had an epidemic amongst the miners that killed hundreds of them, and nobody really understood why this was happening. He went there and carried out a study and studied both the environment and the diseased people, discovered that everything had to do with a parasite it was the duodenal and it made a hole in the jejunum, and thousands of worms nourished or sought nourishment in the patient's blood, and this led to their death. Now, the diagnosis of the jejunum was very important because nobody understood why there was this anemia. But he also found a treatment, and it was a natural product, that is to say, an extract of the male fern, which is one type of fern, and he had an extract which the pharmacist prepared, and this killed these worms. So not only did he diagnose the disease, but he immediately found a cure for it. And once they discovered the cause and the remedy, they also discovered that in all the world, usually in the warmer parts of the world, and in particular the people who worked like farmers, barefooted on the ground, or the ones who made bricks, they were affected by this disease, which was very widespread, because the worm that comes through the jejunum got in through the feet, because the larvae of these worms that are nematodes lived in the ground, and they had to spend some time in the ground, and the people who worked barefooted, and they needed heat. That was why it developed in the St. Gothard, because you know that when you dig galleries, the more you're inside, both horizontally and vertically, the more the temperature rises and it's warmer. So when you drive through a tunnel and halfway through, you will realize that it is warmer. This happens, you create a hot, warm environment where these worms proliferate, and they killed the miners. This treatment spread the world throughout, and it made Perroncito one of the most famous veterinary surgeons ever. Thank you. for Marco Galloni. A round of applause. Marco Galloni is also the scientific director of the Veterinary Science Museum. Here we have news. That is to say, there is such a museum. Where is it? And can it be visited? Yes. It's in Grugliasco. It's in the Department of Veterinary Science. Currently, it's being refurbished, but it's very interesting, and you can come and visit it. You will find all the information on the website of the Department of Veterinary Science. You see that it says museum in the upper part. There's an address, an email address, booking. It's better to book so that there's one of us, Dr. Paola, who is the curator, one of us, or myself, can guide the tour. Oh, yes, so you have very good guides. There are codes, but there is still a question. Talking about the worms, I remember, since I'm not very young, that in the countryside, when a child was ill, the first thing you do is to check for worms. Yes, of course. Of course, these were not as dangerous as the ones that I mentioned, but you have roundworms. All the children who lived in the countryside, just like pinworms, there have always been very widespread parasites that might bother the children. They competitors for food, that is to say, they competed with the children for nourishment. So the children wasted away. In the case of having the worms, then there were other worms, for example, some that only caused bother, and others that were different. There was a bit of everything in parasitology. I'm sorry, can't hear the question. Can we be sure of the meat we eat? Yes, thanks to their work. They were reminding me that Grugliasco may seem far away, but it's a 5-minute railway ride on the Metropolitan train, and during the day there is a train an hour. If there are no other questions, just one. It has been said in the course of the presentation, but maybe we should remember or remind the people of what veterinary surgeons do. What do they do?
Sì, è proprio quella la cosa che è incredibile.
Yes.
Oggi l'attività
This is what is incredible. Currently, the work of a veterinary surgeon affects our everyday life, every aspect of it, every nook and cranny, because as well as treating animals, domestic animals, we have also city animals, wild animals, just from a clinical point of view. And then there's the veterinary inspectors and the work which has to do with infectious diseases. There's public veterinary surgeons involved not only in cattle, but also the ones who, for example, monitor bees. Now, this might seem trivial, but currently bees are very important to maintain biodiversity. So when you sweeten your coffee with honey, you know that there's a veterinary surgeon who's checked this. And if you go on our website, you will find a clip on this. Veterinary surgeons exist in many aspects of your everyday life. And as far as animals are concerned, veterinary surgeons are not only interested in pathology, but also in well-being, welfare. Those who would like to view, who will come and see on Saturday, because for the 250 years, we also have celebrations in all the veterinary spaces, so Fossano, Chivasso, Turin, and we will organize some in Venaria Reale, and on Saturday we have it in Grugliasco. And this refers to city animals, because cities have been built for people but not for animals. Thank you. So a lot needs to be done. And when you plan, there should not only be as the architect, but also in planning you need a veterinary surgeon. Thank you. Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I would say let us meet on Saturday morning for those who wish to go to Grugliasco, twice an hour. It's 1:15 and 1:45. Let's thank our guests, Domenico Bergero, Marco Galloni, and Paola Sacchi. Our next meeting is next week at the Colosseo with Gérard Bourou, the Nobel Prize for Physics, who will be talking about a new light in physics. We'll discover it next week. Thank you very much. Goodbye.